morning here in Canada. I'm in, pardon me, southwestern Ontario. In Cambridge, Ontario. So for those of you that are in and around Cambridge, yes, we named ourselves after you. So anyways, I'm really thrilled to be sharing the research that I've been doing into the impact that COVID is having on volunteer engagement. And I'll go through my initial research findings, and then I'll talk a little bit about some of the implications. And that's really where I want to spend the bulk of the conversation this morning, because I think there's some really meaty things that as a profession we need to start thinking about if we're not already thinking about them, and then actually taking action on and strategically planning. And so without further ado, I'll just start getting into it. Here we go. So as Will said, I have a consulting firm called Spinktank. I offer a lot of stuff. It's all on the screen. One thing that you may have seen is my ebooks, my free ebooks. This year I did top 20 ideas in volunteer engagement for 2020, and actually have had great input from other leaders of volunteers in the UK, including my dear friend Rob Jackson. So something great to pick up. So I want to talk today a little bit about the purpose of the research and who responded to the survey, give you an overview of the high-level findings, and then do a deep dive in a few areas that have already popped up initially as being very significant, I think, and then really, like I said, spending more time on the implications and what's next. So I've said to Will and Vanessa that if you have questions throughout about something I'm speaking about, please put it in the chat. Will and Vanessa are on top of that, and happy to answer any questions. I will go through some of the basic stats fairly quickly. So if there's any confusion, don't hesitate to just pop that question in, and I'll happily answer it. And then we should have a good amount of time at the end of the call for just for open conversation. So the purpose of the research was really to document changes due to the pandemic. And these are changes that are impacting volunteers. They're impacting us as volunteer engagement professionals, and obviously they're impacting a number of organizations, but particularly for us, nonprofit and charitable organizations. And you know, I don't know about you, but I think it's really important to document these changes because the rapidity, the speed of change that is happening makes it really hard to even remember in hindsight how much has changed. So I think it's really important to document the types of changes because they're happening so fast, and really have that kind of touchstone as to where we think things were, but also to really start understanding what the arc of the changes have been, because what I'm suspecting is that while certainly this is an unprecedented experience, or that we can draw from previous things like the 2008-2009 economic recession globally, and really be able to actually start comparing. So when the economy crumbles, what you know, are we seeing consistent trends with volunteering and volunteer engagement? A second piece was really to identify key impacts for advocacy and up communication. This is something that we've lamented about and struggled with as a profession, you know, for the 2 decades plus that I've been involved. I really think you know, this is an opportunity for us to be leaders within our organizations, but also more broadly within society. So I wanted to be able to identify some of these things. And then I really think that it's important that we create a better understanding of how leaders of volunteers and organizations can best support volunteers. We talk about volunteer engagement, but we really don't actually know a lot about what that means and what goes into that. And then certainly to be documenting how volunteers will help us in return, because again, that feeds into that up communication and things like that. So let's talk about who completed the survey. So there was 2 respondent groups. The first one that I'll dive into is us as a peer group, Leaders of Volunteers, and this was around the world. The other respondent group were volunteers themselves. So let's take a look at the Leaders of Volunteers. So we had quite a large sample size, over 800, and not unlike the profession, very highly skewed to female, a pretty good representation, equitable representation of different age demographics. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the pie chart there. I've broken down 4 employment types. One is full-time, which is in the blue. Part-time is in the pink. The green is partial volunteer engagement, which I defined as someone who has some duties related to volunteer engagement, but has other duties in addition, and then unpaid in the purple. In terms of the organizations and sectors that we work in, overwhelmingly, we were from Western society who completed the survey. Canada, you can see Europe and the UK and the US being the top 3. In terms of subsectors, certainly a really good representation, and enough numbers of even smaller groups like arts and culture, that my hope is that over time I might be able to actually pull out some sectoral stuff and compare, for example, animal welfare to education and research, or health, and see, are there differences? Because certainly the one thing that I think we can all recognize is that while COVID has, changed things for all of us, it hasn't changed things in the same way. So in terms of the focus of our organizations, most of us are representing local community organizations, so smaller organizations, and with 1,000 or fewer volunteers. Certainly there was some much larger organizations, but that's important, and I'll just have you kind of put that in the back of your brain, because I did do a bit of an analysis specifically about this kind of aspect of the respondents that I'll go into in a second. So as I said, the other respondent groups were volunteers, much smaller sample size. I'm hoping to continue growing that. A little bit more parity between men and women. Certainly the age groups of the volunteers skewed a little bit older. So typically about, overwhelmingly, 35 and older, with much more skew towards middle age and above, and typically the volunteers were mostly had volunteered for a decade or less at their organizations. They were primarily from Canada. That's where I'm from, and so I had the biggest network and was able to get the most respondents from there, but again, hoping very much to grow that. And the subsectors, as you can see, there was certainly still a good representation in terms of diversity, but not as much equity in terms of the numbers of representatives of each of those. So now that we've kind of got a sense of who's completed the survey, let's start talking about impacts. And the first level of impact I want to share about is on our organizations. And I've got my notes here on another screen, so I apologize. That's why I'm going back and forth. So you remember that when I talked about leaders of volunteers and what kind of organizations they're in, I said that the overwhelmingly largest percentage were local or community organizations who had 1,000 and fewer. So what I did is I cross-sectioned the respondents who said that their organization was local community and who said they had 100 or less volunteers. So what you see, that's the bottom of the graph, the blues. And then what I did is I looked at the number of volunteers that they had indicated were suspended. So if we presume the blue, that for organizations that say they have 1 to 100 volunteers, we then look at the top of the chart and see that for most of them, for over half of them, 100% of their volunteers are suspended right now. which is pretty significant. And for the other half, those, so you can see here, like organizations C, D, G, all across here, they're at the 50% mark. And what I would say is that they may not actually be at the 50% mark. My guess is that they're also at the 100% mark, but the numbers of volunteers and the numbers of volunteers suspended didn't totally match up. And that's what I think here with organization O, if you can see my mouse, where it's only showing 10, well, I was able to say what number of volunteers are suspended, 1 to 10. So my guess is that they may actually only have 10 volunteers, and so in fact 100% of them are suspended. So for local community organizations compared to some of our more regional, provincial or county, and certainly national organizations, the impact has been quite significant on the numbers of volunteers or the percentage of their active volunteer base that are suspended right now. And then when we look at actually these 20 organizations and say, okay, so what is the impact on the clients that you're trying to serve? 50% of their 50% of their client base, or 46%, are being unserved right now. And so I think, particularly for those of us that work in small local community organizations, the impact has been much more significant in terms of not just the volunteer impact, but also the people that normally rely on us and our services as an organization. So I did just want to pull that out because I feel that that is one difference. That just like any kind of pandemic or emergency system, to me, what COVID has really done is highlighted the frailty and the dangers of how dependent smaller organizations are on volunteers, and certainly if we look at these communities, how dependent they are on volunteers, making sure that they're able to deliver services. So the broader impacts on organizations, volunteers, and leaders of volunteers, one of the things I asked was what kind of changes have happened to volunteering and to just general organizational activities. And overwhelmingly what people told me was that they'd stopped in-person volunteering, that they'd suspended or canceled programs and events, and that they'd stopped recruitment and intake as well. So, I mean, those are some pretty significant things. If you see on the end of the graph, the right end of the graph, some organizations kind of were very creative and either shared volunteers with other organizations or redirected volunteers to other organizations. And what I heard anecdotally was that it was primarily organizations that that were on the front lines and those emergency or critical essential services. So for example, let's say you work in a friendly, with friendly visiting with seniors, that may not be feasible. Either you've redirected that friendly visiting to being over the phone or online, or maybe you've redirected those volunteers to a food bank or another frontline service. The other kind of middle kind of columns here is other kind of tweaks that people were making to volunteering. One is, either creating new remote or virtual roles, shifting existing work to online, and things like that. So there's or even taking existing volunteers and saying, what, this program is canceled or suspended right now, so would you be willing to help out in this area that's still continuing? So we saw a good number of that as well. And then in the second and third kind of columns here, what we see is risk mitigation. So, whether that's training volunteers on COVID-19 or doing hand washing things, doing, infection control trainings, things like that. So, so we saw a lot of risk mitigation activity, a lot of redirection and redeployment activity, but overwhelmingly what we saw was just a ceasing of a lot of the activities. And it was interesting because I asked that question about, what changes, if any, have been made. And of the 700 plus respondents, no one said nothing. Nothing was an option, and no one actually indicated that nothing had changed. And so I think that just speaks to how deeply and how pervasive COVID has impacted our work in our organizations. I did ask about virtual volunteering because, of course, everyone's saying, "Oh, well, we'll just transform everything into virtual." And there's some great pieces around why virtual volunteering may or may not be the right idea. So I did ask, prior to COVID-19, what percentage of your volunteer opportunities were virtual or remote? And it was pretty low. Only 10.5% of existing roles were virtual or remote. And then when I looked at, because of course not all of our organizations have a lot of bandwidth or the opportunity based on our mission and our services to create virtual opportunities. You can't virtually help someone, pack a food hamper in a food bank, right? You can't virtually help someone, with personal care or things like that. So, or I often use Habitat for Humanity. You can't virtually build a house for somebody, right? You need to pick up that hammer and be with others. So there are limitations. So for those, removing those organizations that said that they simply just can't accommodate virtual opportunities. It was really fascinating that 27% of the leaders of volunteers said that they had no virtual or remote roles. So that's almost a third. And that's something that, I think we need to just take a look at. I'm not saying I'm for or against virtual volunteering, but I think it's something that's certainly going to become much more important as a discussion point. Whether that's board members and senior leadership saying to us that we need to suddenly create everything virtually or transform everything to virtual, or or otherwise. And then I did ask, what are your plans? Are you going to be creating virtual or remote roles? 45%, almost half, were unsure. 35% said yes, and the others said no, or it's not possible. So, and keep in mind, this survey was launched late March, and it is ongoing. So I am looking to see how are responses changing, and trends in responses changing over time, because I think that is another piece of what's going on right now. So let me just catch up here. So impacts on leaders of volunteers. So I asked about the changes in volunteer interest, and this is where, as I mentioned before, we're all facing changes, but we're not all facing the same changes. And so my reality may be different than yours. So in blue, we saw either, either a flat line or an unknown change. So unknown, no change, or recruitment was suspended, so you really couldn't tell. In red, we saw the decreases, either small, moderate, or significant. And then in black, we see the increases. And so actually what we saw was, I was surprised by how many people saw an increase versus how many people saw a decrease, especially knowing that recruitment was suspended. But it was fairly equitable. So 36% saw an increase, 46% saw a decrease. And so I think that's, again, something to see over time. I did want to ask about employment changes, because we know from living through these types of chaotic periods that leaders of volunteers are usually the last hired and first fired. So it was very important to me that we kind of dig into this, and certainly we saw some changes. So if we look at the screen there, what I've done is I've broken it down into those 4 employment types. And so we certainly saw a number of people laid off, let go, or furloughed, or that they had team members laid off, let go, furloughed, people with hours reduced, some people with hours increased. Either, no changes to their work, but changes to other people's work, work increasing, and certainly a lot of concern about job security. But the overwhelming change was that a lot of people's duties changed. When you've got recruitment suspended, when you're not, actively engaging with volunteers in programs and events, because those have been suspended or canceled, then you're going to have your duties shifted. And what I'm going to be interested in seeing is that over time, do those go back? As we look at re-engagement, at reopening, are those duties going back to VE? Because that could be a very dangerous piece for us. And when I added up, just to go back to the laid off, let go, furloughed, when I added up the numbers, you know, of people who said, you know, that they themselves or a member of, you know, the volunteer engagement team, it added up to, you know, I'll share this on the next screen, but it was 1,000 to 2,000 leaders of volunteers, which, considering that this is a fairly small sample size, is not insignificant. And certainly, you know, this data was pulled start of May. And so my expectations is that we will have see an increase in this coming. Certainly, when I completed the survey, I would have answered one way, and in 2 months' time, just to share, I've gone from a team of 12 to a team of 2 with my team. So pretty significant changes. And you can see that, I mean, a lot of people said, you know, overwhelmingly they said, no, I'm, you know, myself, no one's impacted, but certainly when you look here towards the larger size teams, you know, there's been some pretty big changes to those teams. So I think that that's something interesting to take note of, and that I'll be continuing to track. And I'll just share now, but I'll reinforce this at the end, is that the survey is ongoing. So if you haven't participated, you're still very welcome to. I'm hoping to release this weekend phase 2. So even for people who may have completed the survey, what I'm asking you to do is to go back into the survey, and it'll ask you, have you completed the survey already? And if yes, then really what I'm looking to get at is more comparative questions to say, okay, so what has changed since you last completed the survey? So for me, I would say, well, before I may have said I lost a few team members, and now I've pretty much lost my entire team. So those are that's my way of trying to track the changes over time. But I'm also going to be segmenting, you know, the timing of respondents and seeing, are we seeing, you know, the bulk of the changes and the laid off or furloughed staff coming later, because I sadly suspect that you know, we're not at the peak yet. Another piece that I investigated was decision-making involvement. We talk a lot in volunteer engagement about that we're never at the right tables, that we're never at this decision-making tables, that we don't have enough power. And so I wanted to document that. And in fact, what I would say is that it's based on what I'm seeing here, it's not totally true. Overall, 66% of us were involved in the decision-making within our organizations as it impacted volunteers. And then I did actually break it down by the type of employment, and this is where things got interesting. So for full-time and part-time leaders of volunteers, which is the blue and the pink here, they were exactly at 66% were involved in decision-making. But then when you actually move it to the partial volunteer engagement people, they were actually at 71% were involved. And then when you moved it to the unpaid group, which again is a very small sample size, it's only 14 there, they actually were at 86% were involved. And what I'm surmising from this is a couple things. One is that for people who are who have partial VE duties, it may be that they have more influence and power within the organization because of their other duties, whether that's related to HR or, you know, a lot of times that's where we get lumped in with. And then for unpaid, my sense is that these may be people who are representing either all volunteer-led organizations or much smaller organizations where there may be less of a hierarchy. And so they're at those decision-making tables. So that's my guess. I don't know for sure, but I do think it's very interesting to say that partial and unpaid leaders of volunteers are 5 to 20% more likely to be involved in decision-making than full-time or part-time leaders of volunteers. So just a little bit there. So in terms of the challenges that I heard from leaders of volunteers, it was really about looking ahead. So many people kind of have their heads down and are focused so much on this that they're really not looking about, what does the future hold? What does post-quarantine volunteering look like? How have people's lives changed? What are the best practices in restarting volunteer activity, and even questioning, will all programs restart? A lot of people commented on the fact that volunteers and volunteering engagement was a low priority within the organization, that people were in just kind of, and very understandably, crisis mode. But what that means is, in times of crisis, a lot of people forget about the power and and importance of volunteers as stakeholders. And that led to a lot of comments about concerns with relationship management and stewarding volunteers. Interesting, there was a lot of talk about risk aversion, that organizations were very risk averse, that they didn't want to try things like virtual volunteering, which is ironic because there was also a lot of talk about limitations or challenges with technology adoption. And for those of you that have read Toby Johnson's great Volunteer Management Progress Report, this year she did a deep dive into technology and talked about how behind the times we are as a profession in adopting technology. And I know certainly Rob and I have talked about that. Andy Fryer's talked a lot about that. So it's very ironic that this is, all kind of coming to a head. And then, of course, there was a lot of talk about concerns for mental health and wellness, not just of us as staff, but for our volunteers and for our clients. So very, very big challenges there. So impacts on volunteers. 66% of them said that they had to make changes to their volunteering due to COVID, whether that was because, schools and daycares were closed and so they had children at home full time, whether their jobs had changed, they're caring for family members and neighbors and friends. And happily, on a good note, 84% of volunteers said that their opinion of the organization they volunteered for had improved either moderately or significantly. So those are some good things. And now what I'd like to do is a bit of a deep dive into what volunteers told me would improve their experience during COVID-19. And it really kind of bubbled up into 3 themes in my mind. One was about communication and transparency. Another one was around connection. And the third was just a pat on the back to keep up the good work. Excuse me. So in terms of communication and transparency, I've got some quotes on the screen. What they really wanted to hear from us, to know and to hear was just, tell us more. Even if you say there's no updates, they want to know that there's no updates. Reassure, be honest, but also be honest about the challenges and the timeframes. Clarity on strategic plans, reopening, the view of the future of the organization. A lot of organizations are going to be forever changed, due to this. And volunteers aren't stupid. They know that we're facing significant challenges because they themselves are facing them in their own lives, and they know there's going to be an impact. So communication, a regular communication and transparency is really important. And I did a bit of specific questions around communication, and what I asked volunteers on the left-hand side of the screen there was, how many times have you been communicated with so far? And again, keep in mind that this is a snapshot of a point in time. But overall, mostly people have said either weekly or more in terms of how many times they've been communicated with. And in terms of communication preference, they were happy for it to stay the same, or even a little bit more. So I do think that reinforces the old adage that you can never under-communicate or over-communicate, especially in times of crisis when there's so much going on. One of the questions that I've been asked to include in the second phase of the survey was the types of communication. So do they want to hear updates via Facebook? Do they want phone calls? Do they want other things? So I'm hoping to include that question. I do want to put in a bit of a caveat. And the reality is that while certainly there was a lot of positive feedback from volunteers about how organizations and how we have been supporting them and handling things. You know, there is like that, like I said, a little bit of a caveat. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you see the ranking of volunteers and how confident they are in how our organizations have been handling COVID. And it goes from top to bottom. So as you can see, the top of the pyramid is much bigger than the end of it in terms of the width. So we had, you know, 63 said yes, I'm very confident. 28 ranked that they're 9 out of 10 confident. So you see the numbers go down. So overall, volunteers are very confident. But what I would say is that if we look at the right-hand side of the screen, what we see is that also these are very engaged or engaged volunteers. And so I think we need to, there's two kind of key takeaways in my mind from this. One is that people who think well of us, it takes a lot, I think, for them to not think well of us. And we'll go into a little bit of that in a second with some other quotes of volunteers and some of the implications. But the other thing that I think is really important that resonated with me is that this is why volunteer engagement is so important, because, and I'm going to go off on a little tangent here, but my master's research quantified the concept of volunteer engagement. And we talk a lot of volunteer engagement as a verb. We talk, well, I'm going to engage them, but engagement is actually an outcome, and it's a sustained outcome. It's not like satisfaction, which ebbs and flows a little bit more regularly. Engagement is a long-term outcome. It's kind of like our values. They do change, but they don't change terribly quickly. It would be over a prolonged period of time. And so what I think we're seeing here is the success of what we do and the value of what we do as leaders of volunteers. So when we have been able to ensure that our organizations create a fertile environment for volunteers who choose to become engaged with us, and you know, an engagement, what that means is that, you know, they're really they're connecting their head, their hand, and their heart into their work. They're going above and beyond. They're dedicated. They become incredible net promoters for us. And so what I think we're seeing here is the result of us investing a lot into the kind of engagement bank and the relationship bank with volunteers. And so as a result, what we're seeing is fairly positive feedback from volunteers about how we're doing. So for the survey, if you know of any disengaged volunteers, please let me know. Please encourage them to complete the survey, because I'd really love to be able to share. I think it would be so invaluable to our work as leaders of volunteers if I was able to share that when you disengage a volunteer, or you do not create that fertile ground, because of course engagement is a two-way street. We can only go so far, and so can they. If we are creating all sorts of opportunities and a great environment, and someone chooses not to become engaged for whatever reasons, then that's not going to work. But so too, a lot of volunteers tend to be people who are easily engaged, and if we're not creating that fertile ground to sustain that, then they become disengaged, or they never become engaged, and then we don't see the results. We don't see the confidence. We don't see all the other pieces that I'm going to go into in a few minutes about the ways that they support our organizations and are looking to continue supporting our organizations during times of crisis. So I really think that is why volunteer engagement is such a critical piece, and that we play such a critical part of creating that outcome. So the second theme that I mentioned was connection. And so we see some quotes on the screen that not only are volunteers wanting to connect with us on a very personal level, but they want to connect with each other. And so we, you know, when I think about the statistics on volunteering, so many people volunteer as a social outlet, as a way to build relationships, to grow relationships. And I know in the UK, there's a lot of work around volunteering, reducing isolation and loneliness. And I think that this really speaks to that. And I particularly appreciated and included a long quote in the center there, because it really talks about, you know, volunteers we know are 10 times more likely to be donors than non-volunteers. And those who volunteer, I believe it's 66 hours or more a year, though their donations are over $500, so about £200 more on average than volunteers who, people who volunteer less than 66 hours a week, a year. And so we know that volunteering, like I like to joke, is a gateway drug to supporting our organization. And those who volunteer, it really becomes a conduit into all sorts of ways that they support the organization, tangibly and intangibly. And I think, we often silo volunteers, as when we talk, well, we're going to talk to volunteers, we're going to talk to donors, we're going to talk to participants, without really realizing a lot of the time that volunteers are in each of those groups, right? We don't talk to volunteers as if that's the only thing that they do, because invariably the likelihood is that that's not the only thing they do. And so especially with the crisis communications that have come out from organizations, what we're seeing is that donors are getting communicated with either first or more robustly than volunteers, and we're really doing ourselves a disservice because they're also getting those communications. And so we say trite things like, oh, as such an important part of our organization as a volunteer, we want you to know. And they're like, yeah, I knew last week when you'd already communicated with donors, right? So the middle quote on the screen there really speaks to, I may not be a major donor, but I make a major contribution to this organization, and I want to be valued as such. And I think that that's certainly something that resonated with me, and I hope resonates with you, because that's, I think, a very fair statement. And then the last theme was really like, keep up the good work. So give ourselves a pat on the back. I know it has been an incredibly difficult few months for all of us. I don't think anybody would say different. But what we're hearing from volunteers is that they really do have confidence and faith that we're doing the best that we can do. And 91% of volunteers said that they plan to return to active volunteering. So that's pretty amazing. In terms of the implications, there's a few that I want to talk about. One is that there is a disconnect between new programs and existing volunteer base. So one of the questions I asked leaders of volunteers was, is your organization planning any new programs due to COVID-19? I also then asked them as a follow-up question, what percentage of your existing volunteer base do you think will be interested and or a fit with the new program? And a lot of this was, potentially around virtual volunteering. We know that for many of our organizations, we rely heavily on, a demographic of volunteers that is aging out of place. And we really haven't reconciled that. We haven't come to terms with the fact that the way that we've structured our organizations, the way that we've structured the work of our organizations, is dependent on a foundation that is eroding beneath our feet. And so there's a huge disconnect, what I found. So, more than half of the organizations, had already developed or were planning new programs, but they felt as leaders of volunteers that only 32% of the existing volunteer base would be a fit or interested in participating and supporting these new programs. And so when I actually added up the numbers, that was a gap of almost 100,000 volunteers in terms that we would need to recruit to support these new programs. So certainly that is an opportunity for us to tap into perhaps some new skills that maybe we haven't engaged heavily with before. But also the reality is that we know generally volunteering is slightly declining. It goes through different blips and things like that. But overall, what we know is that when we look at the life cycle of people, we know that youth volunteer the most in terms of per capita, more youth volunteer than other age demographics, but they volunteer the least frequent. Seniors, that kind of foundation that we've been really heavily relying on, volunteer the least. but they volunteer the most hours, and they're really those stalwarts of our organizations that we rely on to come in every week and do whatever we need them to do. And that's the foundation that I'm assuming is not going to be, moving forward, or is not seen as a fit, or being interested in these new programs. We also know that there's going to be massive repercussions for many years. The ripple impacts of COVID with people, if they've been furloughed or laid off and let go, we may see increases in volunteering, of people wanting to stay active, to keep their skills sharp, to network, all of that. But we also know that people may be less able to volunteer because they're really focused on either job searching, retraining, reschooling, or continuing to support family members, or just looking for work. So I think we're going to see a bit of a mixed bag of things. The second kind of implication is damaged relationships, diminished trust, and goodwill and support. So 15% of the volunteer respondents indicated that their opinion had actually moderately or significantly declined. And 13% of volunteers said that they would decrease volunteering. And so I do want to just add my personal interpretation of that 13%. I do think a lot of that is due to other non-organizational related, pardon me, non-organizational related impacts. So I think a lot of the where that 13% saying that they would decrease volunteering is due to those other impacts of COVID, whether that's childcare, job insecurity or changes, family support, things like that. There's going to be people who, because of the stock market changes and things like that, people who were planning on retiring, who may have been more inclined to volunteer and had more time to volunteer, no longer able to retire when they had planned. We're coming to the end of the baby boomer generation in terms of being at the cusp of retirement. So I think that that's going to definitely play a factor. So, so we've definitely, even within a very highly engaged volunteer base of respondents, seen some declines and some issues. And certainly when we compare that to one quote that we had from someone saying, I already had a high opinion of them, their handling has confirmed that, it really, it makes a difference. And so on that note, one of the things that I did was I looked at the changes in volunteer support post COVID-19. So I asked volunteers, after COVID-19, how do you anticipate that your support of the organizations will change? So in the blue, we see a stop or a decrease. So decreasing or stopping advocacy, stopping being a donor, or decreasing being a donor, and decreasing being a volunteer being the biggest, which is that 13%. But keep in mind, like I said, I think there are broader reasons for that. And then in the black, we see increases. So an increase of advocacy, an increase of donations, which says that, at least a quarter of the respondents are already donors. They're looking to increase that. And certainly overwhelmingly, we see at the bottom of the screen, almost 100% or 91% said that they were going to increase their volunteering. And then in green, the two columns in green, becoming an advocate, becoming a donor. So people are going to increase overwhelmingly their support on multiple levels of our organization. And I think that's really important for us to communicate, is that if we're getting pushback, or if we're getting railroaded, or having barriers put up in front of us about communicating and really valuing volunteer relationships at this time, this is what's at stake. It is our ambassadors, it is our donors, it is the future ability of us to run many of our programs and services, which are often very heavily dependent or entirely run by volunteers. So this is what's at risk. And I think leaders within our organization, senior leadership, the board, they need to understand this, they need to see this. There's also just the reality that we're having exposure to significant risks and ethical dilemmas. And I've got a quote on the screen here about from one woman who said, you know, the response was not good. They wanted us to volunteer, even though, and this is I'm assuming a long-term care or hospital organization she volunteers with, the residents were at high risk and public health was telling us to stay home. I felt pressured to continue coming in. And really, I could never forgive myself if a resident became sick or died because of me. And this same woman actually went on to share a little bit more that she's a single mom, that she has 2 children who are still in school, who themselves and she have health concerns, and put them at higher risk. And she felt very very dismayed and disillusioned that her organization was really trying to put so much pressure on her to continue. And so, there's definitely some undue risks. There's ethical dilemmas. One of the other ones is, there's a lot of talk about, if we reopen, if we are engaged, should we disallow volunteers of a certain age? So if we know that higher risk is 65 and older, do we not let volunteers who are 65 and older volunteer? Well, what kind of age discrimination issues are we uncovering there? And really, even questions like, if someone, because of the tracing that's being done, if someone was someone who was a volunteer was able to actually trace back that they had contracted COVID due to their volunteering with us, and God forbid something happens to them or a family member, what are the implications of that? And I'm not a legal scholar, I'm just asking the questions, the things that we kind of need to be thinking about. And really, are we protecting all of our stakeholders equally, right? Because if we're asking volunteers to be taking on really key critical roles, just like some staff are, we need to be protecting them equitably. And I know that the employment laws are a little bit different in different countries, but certainly in Canada and mostly for the US, they do not differentiate between whether someone's paid or unpaid. It's really about the nature of the work that they're doing and our obligations as organizations towards that. So what's next? The analysis continues, and as I said, the second wave is under development. I'm hoping to have it launched by next week. So maybe just to start off, I'm sure there may be a number of questions, but would love to hear in the chat, what do you want to know about in the second wave of the survey? So let me know, Will, if there's any questions.
Brilliant. Thank you, Erin. That was really, really informative. It's really good to see data from across the world and from such a large data set to see how volunteer management has been affected, but also how volunteers has been affected as well. It's really spurned an extensive chat through the chat function today as well about enrichment and understanding how important volunteers are. And it'll be good to be able to go through this at another point as well once it's uploaded onto HVG. I do have a couple of questions for you today. So sort of start from the top, really. It was really interesting to see about the impact on small organizations in particular. Do you get an idea of a potential long-term impact on small organizations compared to large, or is that too early to tell?
I think it's too early to tell, and I haven't, these are just initial findings. My guess is that, and again, this is a Canadian, North American view, but a lot of the smaller community organizations are ones who are often fee for service. So it's things like youth programs like camps and after school programming. It's things like Meals on Wheels. And so I think that there's going to be a tremendous impact. I really worry about small organizations' abilities to weather this storm financially, because basically their revenues have been decimated. They don't, typically smaller organizations don't have a pipeline for major gifts. They don't have corporate sponsorships to keep them afloat. And so I really do think that, and this is one of the other reasons why I wanted to kind of continue documenting over time the arc of the changes, because I think that is unfortunately going to be one of the things that we're going to have to come to terms with. And of course, you know, I did mention this earlier, but I think that COVID, just like any crisis, really it exposes the cracks and the inequities of our system. So, for example, even with education in Canada here, a lot of our schooling went online. Well, the reality is that not all families can afford multiple laptops or iPads or things like that. They don't all have high-speed internet, which is sometimes required, and so this is a very isolating and inequitable kind of situation that is just exasperated by things like COVID. So I worry deeply, but I'm hoping I will be wrong.
Yeah, the same. I think coming from a small organization myself, I've seen how many of our volunteers have been, how dependent we have been on them, and how we are now trying to identify how we can mitigate any potential delay in returning volunteers. Some of the questions that came up were around, particularly around avoiding disengagement, and whether you found out whether you found out from those volunteers who weren't looking to come back, what sort of reasons why, or whether it was a temporary delay in coming back, whether they plan to come back maybe once if they found safer.
Yeah, so certainly if I just go back to this screen here, I mean, I definitely think there is an indication that volunteers want to come back, but I think that there's definitely fear, and keeping in mind that, you know, this is the sample size of the volunteer respondents does skew a bit older, and so that may be different. So it may be a very different thing for students or younger people than for older people. And I'm hoping to do a deeper dive in the second phase to say, you know, what are the barriers that you're worried about that would stop you from returning to volunteer? There were comments from volunteers really talking about how am I going to be kept safe? How am I going to help keep others safe? So very much like that quote about the volunteer who was fearing for the welfare of the residents that she was supporting. So there was a lot of talk about things like PPE and other, you know, equipment and procedures to keep people safe. I think for some people, they will not return. You know, they especially because, you know, it seems like just as we're reopening, there's another bump and spike in things. So I think people will get very tired and exhausted, and I think it's very natural for some people to just be like, I care about this organization, but I'm, you know, there's a trauma, there's an emotional and physical trauma. So I think that's something that we should anticipate seeing. And I don't know how to mitigate that other than just with really a lot of leadership from us in terms of thinking about these things, talking to volunteers, making sure that we have, you know, best in class practices set up for safety protocols for volunteers, that we're communicating regularly about those things, you know, and really thinking about how we can shift things to keep everyone safe but still deliver quality services and programs.
Thank you. Another question which came up earlier on was about you shared a number of slides around how the pandemic had affected job positions. For example, some may have lost their roles, others were furloughed. I don't know if you went into looking into specifically different areas, perhaps looking at UK, for example, where like the furloughing scheme has potentially delayed the termination of many positions. I don't know whether if you saw a trend within that, within certain parts of the world or globe.
Yeah, my intent is to actually like start looking at kind of culling out different countries, because certainly in the UK you have the furloughing. In Canada we have the CEWS, which is the the COVID emergency wage subsidy, which the federal government put in place to avoid people being furloughed, which pays for 75% of people's wages up to a certain point. And that's why I certainly want to continue doing this survey and looking at changes over time, because I agree. I think that this is just a delay. For example, my organization is anticipating an $80 million revenue drop this year. They're also budgeting for an $80 million drop in revenue next year. So they are anticipating that that this will continue over 2 years. And like I said, that's why I kind of pulled out the smaller groups, because they don't have the reserves that larger organizations do oftentimes. And so they're just that much more vulnerable. But my hope is that I will be able to cull out regional pieces, because it really does depend on, every country has had a slightly different experience and a slightly different timeline around COVID. And I think it's important to pull out those pieces.
Great, thank you. I'm conscious of time, so I think I just move on to a couple of the questions around potential things to, I think a lot of people are really interested in the second survey and are already asking questions about its content. Particularly around how volunteer managers are planning, and perhaps will there be ways so we can collect and see how different organisations are planning? And I don't know if Lucy wanted to come in at this point. I know Lucy had a question about the next survey. Maybe not. Nonetheless, about whether, so where we're looking at, where the survey will look at recruitment practices and those sort of elements, especially as we're going into this period of time where we're looking, as you're saying, there's volunteering gaps based on these new programs, so we may need to recruit. So what strategies people are putting in place, are they going to recruit from different sources, for example? I think that'll be interesting to a lot of people. And just those sort of themes around it. I know we've got a few other questions, but I'm conscious of time. Would you be happy for me to send an email list of further questions so I can relay to them next week, perhaps?
Absolutely, I'd be happy to.
Brilliant, thank you so much. We'll draw to a close now then. Thank you, Erin, for coming and speaking today. It has been a really insightful conversation about the impact of COVID-19 across the globe on the volunteering sector, both on its leaders and the organisations and the volunteers themselves. I'm looking forward to seeing the next survey and hope we get even more people taking part. 800 is a brilliant figure and a really useful insight into volunteering. I don't know if you want to close with a statement.
Just to say thank you very much for the opportunity. I encourage you, reach out to me, share with Will those questions. I'm hoping that we can have a really good sample size and an increase in the volunteer sample size, because the more information we have, the better decisions and the more informed we are. So I appreciate your support in completing and sharing the survey. And like I said, I'm hoping next week the second phase will be out, and would love to hear your thoughts from the questions that Will shares about how I can include questions that are going to help you be as informed as possible. So thank you very much for the opportunity.